The Bootstrap Podcast Show is a production of Kangaroo Fern Media Lab, a grassroots entrepreneur-led movement to bring together, celebrate and give a voice to Australia's entrepreneurship community. On the podcast, we speak with the movers and shakers of Australia's entrepreneurship community to give a glimpse into the future of business. Bootstrap Podcast on AusPod Syndicate.
Daniel Gefen went from jumping on the class tables and getting a detention for wanting attention, impacting millions of people in his underwear. He went from being completely invisible with no online following to growing his top-rated podcast, Can I Pick Your Brain, to over 250,000 downloads, interviewing billionaires and world-class leaders, ranked in the top 100 business podcasts in iTunes, and becoming an international best-selling author of The Self-Help Addict in less than 2 years. After being pitched hundreds of times by Lazy PR agency, he launched Gefen Media Group, one of the first podcast booking agency and helped influential authors sells hundreds of thousands of books by getting them on top-rated podcasts. Seeing the gap in the market for people who couldn't afford to hire a booking agency, he launched PodBooker, a platform for guests and hosts to easily connect. Daniel lives in Israel with his wife of 13 years and 5 little rascal. You can check him on his website at danielgefen.com and on his own company, gefenmediagroup.com, and you can also check him on LinkedIn, Gefen Media.
Thanks for tuning into our podcast. We love having you here, and it's our mission to bring you all the latest and greatest tips, skills, and know-how to make you the best that you can be. We know that you have it in you, and we're going to show you how. Now, let's get started.
Please welcome Daniel Gefen. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Bootstrap.
Hey, Mimiko. Thank you for having me on.
Let's start with a quote on one of your on your website. So this is what you said on your website. My mission is to help people discover their voice and share their message with the world. What do you mean about that?
Well, I think everybody has a specific message that they're here to do on this planet. And my goal is to help them to deliver that message. And right now, I feel like the most powerful medium to spread a message is with the voice, with the power of audio. It used to be that the written word was the most powerful, right? And then TV came about, and it was very visual. But now I feel like we're in an era where audio has taken over. And the reason why that is, for those that are listening to this right now on the podcast, most likely you are, doing the dishes or going grocery shopping or going, taking your dog for a walk, or maybe you're driving your car, you might be on a train, but you're doing something, right? Whereas when you're reading a book or watching a YouTube video, you can't do that while you're going for a run or doing anything for that matter. You need to get full focus on that medium, and that's why I believe that audio has taken off, and why now there's hundreds of millions of people around the world listening to podcasts, and that number is growing every day.
Your podcast journey starts here. Take the first step on your side. Hustle with us. It starts with a great domain. Get your podcast web host with Beard and Coffee at www.beardandcoffee.com.au or find us at Facebook.
So let's go back on your Yankee years. So it's saying you've been jumping on the classroom table, getting detention for wanting an attention. So how this situation happened during your younger years, become one of the best-selling author and also a top-rated podcast? How does it happen?
It's a journey. It's a lot of work and a lot of good luck. I think good timing, There is, people say there's no such thing as luck. Well, it depends on how you define luck, right? The one of the best quotes I've heard is, the harder you work, the luckier you get. You have to do the work, otherwise, you don't get lucky if you're not out there trying. The more you try, the more you're going to find yourself in lucky situations. But luck definitely has, it plays a part, and you could define luck in different ways. For me, luck is really God given. So in Hebrew we call it mazal, and God set up a world that's purpose driven. It's there for a reason, and we're here for a reason. Everyone's here for a reason. So as long as we're doing our work, we're doing the best that we can do while we're here, then usually good things, will happen, especially if you're, at the right place at the right time. So for me, I went from sort of really struggling to figure things out, and then worked very hard on myself. That's number one, working on yourself to feel good about yourself, and to have a strong belief in yourself, and a belief in how the world works, right? And getting a good idea of human nature and how people work, and what people really want. And the more that I worked on that, the luck kind of played its role, and I got on a phone call about 4 years ago with someone who said, I'd love to have you on my podcast. And I didn't know what a podcast was 4 years ago. I said, what's a podcast, And from there, I went on his podcast as a guest and fell in love with the microphone, and thought this was incredible. Wow, I've got to do more of this. This is so much fun. And I asked him how many people were listening to the podcast, and I expected him to say maybe 20, 30 people. And he said over 1,000 people. And I almost fell off my chair. I thought, whoa, that's a lot of people listening to me. Where are these people? And he said, well, they're all over the world. He started listing all these different countries. And that's when I realized the power of audio, which is podcasting. And I decided I need to, get more into the podcast space and invest my time and effort into podcasting. So I started my own podcast 2 weeks after, called Can I Pick Your Brain? And I did not know anything about podcasting. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to set it up. I didn't know how to, even getting guests. I didn't know how to get guests for my show. I wanted to get big guests, but I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't know how to get people to follow my show. How do I get them to listen to the podcast? This was the problem. And so I had this aha moment when I realized, well, instead of figuring this out myself, why don't I leverage other people's audiences? So there are many podcasters out there already with audiences. I'll just go be a guest on their show, and then hopefully they'll come and listen to my podcast. So that's what I did. And that's how I essentially, in a very short period of time, grew it to over 250,000 downloads in less than 2 years. Ended up interviewing, some really big guests, billionaires and Fortune 500 CEOs and New York Times bestselling authors. And then I wrote a book myself, and that became a #1 bestseller on Amazon. And this was all just getting on podcasts. And I realized that this was an undervalued attention. This was undervalued attention because it's a market that people still don't fully, it's underestimated. There are hundreds of millions of people that are listening to podcasts today, and it's free to get on podcasts. It doesn't cost any money to be on podcast. So that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is that I started getting bombarded with pitches from PR agencies and book publicists and people trying to get on my podcast, or trying to get their clients on my podcast as guests. And the problem is that they didn't have a relationship with me, and they didn't, position themselves in the right way. They sounded boring. They sounded like everybody else. And so I just kept saying no to all of these pitches, and I would get dozens of these a day. And then after a couple of months, I woke up one morning.
This podcast is brought to you by AusPod Syndicate, powered by Kangaroo Fern Media Lab. Kangaroo Fern is Australia's independent video and podcast management agency with a mission to help individuals and entrepreneurs to start their own podcasts and harness the power of podcasting. Book now via www.kangaroofern.com.
And a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, hold on a second. I have a top-rated podcast. I'm friends with top-rated hosts, so I've got the relationships already. I understand the podcasting space. I've been a guest on over 60 podcasts. I've had over 150 high-profile guests on my show, so I know what a great guest should sound like and how to position them and present them in the right way so that hosts want them on their show. So why don't I start a podcast booking agency? And that's how my booking agency, Gefen Media Group, was born. And we ended up getting a lot of clients booked on the top podcasts, and we still do that today. It's been now 3.5 years. But then a year ago, I had an idea that there's a lot of people that can't afford an agency. They can't afford thousands of dollars to get on the top podcasts. And on the flip side, there are over 1.5 million podcasts now, and only the top, maybe 10% are getting guests. The rest of them, nobody knows about them, so they're not getting, they're not pitching them. And so how do they find guests? So you have these two markets that are not being served. And that's when I had the idea for podbooker.com. So podbooker.com is a platform where anyone can sign up for free as a guest, and they can reach out to hosts and get booked on podcasts from the platform. You could search for any podcasts that you're interested in. And as a host, you could set up a podcast profile, and you can look for guests, and you can invite guests to be on your show.
Looks amazing. So for our listener, and especially the doing a startup now or thinking of getting their own business, what do you think is your advice to them if they're thinking of they have an idea, just like you have an idea of a gap in the market, you launch the PodBooker. So what do you advise to people listening and watching right now that they have an idea but afraid to go ahead about their idea?
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss an episode by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
Right. So fear is really could be your best friend, and it could be your worst enemy. Fear is there for a reason. It's there to help us to survive, right? If we didn't have fear, we would probably die very quickly because we'd be jumping into fires and jumping off cliffs and doing all sorts of crazy things because we'd have no fear. So first thing is to recognize that fear is a good thing, but it has to be it has to be in its place and its time. And fear, when it's not the right time and it's not the right place, it must be told that this is not the time and the place, right? So you have to learn to have a relationship with your fear and to communicate with fear, to say, I understand this is you are warning me, you're giving me a warning, but this is okay. This is a place where I can feel safe and I can feel comfortable, even though it might be a bit scary. So, for example, getting on a podcast might be scary at first, right? You're going on a show and people are listening to you, and you may say something really stupid or whatever, but it's okay because that's how we learn, that's how we grow. If a child was afraid to fall, he would never learn to walk, right? So we all had to overcome fear in order to be regular human beings, just to function in life, just to be able to walk around and drive a car. Driving a car at first is very scary. I remember when I was driving the car with my my dad was freaking out. I was freaking out. He was freaking out. We were both freaking out because any minute I thought we were going to smash into something. But today, thank God I'm able to drive around, and it's very useful. So we have to learn to get past the fear in order to grow, in order to advance in life.
Right now, due to the pandemic, the podcasting arena, the space, are getting more notice. Some people say the power of podcast, it can do a lot of things. On for our business people or entrepreneurs, why do you think the podcasting you need to have a podcast if you have your own business? Say, well, is that going to be helpful? The podcasting for a business?
100%. Podcasting is just a medium, right? That's all it is. So TV is a medium, radio is a medium, social media is a medium. Sending sales letters back in the day, that's what you did. You wrote out a letter and you would send it in the mail, and that's how you reached your potential clients, right? Then you had newspapers and magazines, and then you would put an ad in the newspapers and the magazines and radio and then TV, and social media came out and internet. And so podcast is just another form of communication, and it's just another way to communicate with your ideal clients. But it happens to be one of the most powerful. And the reason why is because people nowadays are sick and tired of being sold to and advertise and being advertised to and marketed to. We don't like to be interrupted. When you're scrolling on your Instagram feed or your Facebook feed, you're there because you want to, either socialize with some of your network, or you want to just, chill out and, take in some information or entertainment. You're not interested in buying anything. So if an ad pops up, you kind of just move it away, right? When you are watching a YouTube video, you don't want to watch an ad. You want to get straight to your content. The ad is annoying. You have to skip it, get out the way. And so in a generation where advertising has become very unwanted and distasteful, content is the key. People want content. The proof of it is that people binge content. Look at Netflix, for example. That's a content machine that people binge. Facebook is a content machine that people binge. Instagram is a content machine that people binge. So if you can create content that people will consume, and then
We are Independent Podcast Network. We are Guerrilla Podcast Syndicate. Would you like to hear your brand while supporting quality podcasts? Contact us now at advertise@guerrillapodcastsyndicate.com.
by consuming that content, they create a connection with you on a personal level, well, then they're going to be way more likely to buy from you, because we buy from people. We don't buy from ads. We buy from the people who are behind the product, the people who have a mission, who have a purpose, who have a message, who can help us, who have been where we've been before. If I can trust you because I relate to you, then I'm more likely to buy from you. And right now, the best way to do that is by being a guest on podcasts, because that's where the attention is. Right now, that's where the attention is. There's roughly an attention span of about 8 seconds, which is 1 second less than a goldfish. And on social media, it's about 3 seconds. So there's very little connection that you can make in 3 seconds with a human being. Very little, if any. Whereas with podcasting, so the average podcast is around 45 minutes long. So that means you've got someone's attention for, on average, 45 minutes. That's a long time in today's generation to be able to have somebody's attention for that long. It's a gold mine.
Since it's in relation with on the business, you already have a podcast. How would you convert an engagement listener into a fantastic follower?
It's a good question. Well, that's all about telling good stories, number one, because people love a good story. And two is knowing your audience and delivering value, essentially. Trying to imagine what your audience wants to hear. What are they struggling with? And when you know what your audience is struggling with, and you have the ability to help them in some way, that's how they're going to end up following you and wanting more of your content and buying into whatever it is that you're selling, if it could help them.
we'll talk about the Can I Pick Your Brain podcast. Can you give us an overview of your podcast and advice shared during a typical episode?
Well, so Can I Pick Your Brain was my first podcast. That's where I sort of interviewed some really big entrepreneur guests. Some of you probably heard of, like Robert Kiyosaki and Russell Brunson and Noah Kagan and all these other great guests. So that's what the podcast is about. I've also launched a new podcast called Grow Your Show. And Grow Your Show is where I interview other podcast hosts who have millions of downloads. And pretty much the goal is to help people who are either thinking of starting a podcast and wanting to learn how to grow their audience, or if you've got an existing podcast, you want to grow to have a bigger audience and to be able to also monetize your podcast. How do you make money out of having a podcast? So yeah, I would highly recommend, if anyone's listening to this that either has a podcast or thinking of having a podcast, to subscribe to Grow Your Show so they could find out how to grow and monetize their podcast.
How is the PodBooker started?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, so podbooker.com came about because I realized that there was a gap in the market where it was hard for people to find podcasts to pitch in order to get booked on their shows. And there's a big market of hosts, podcast hosts that are looking for guests. And so that's the goal of podbooker.com, is really it's like a dating platform where they could essentially, reach out to each other and get booked.
What is the most critical skills for like an entrepreneur or a business owner to master in order to be successful in podcasting?
Probably I would say number one is belief. Belief is number one. If you don't believe in yourself, you'll never succeed at anything, right? It starts with belief. Yeah, everything starts with a belief. So if you want to be better at anything, focus first on believing that you can be better at that thing. Work on believing in yourself and work on believing in whatever it is that you're doing. So, for example, with PodBooker, I had to believe in the product before building the product, right? I had a real belief that this is going to help people. If you're selling something and you don't believe in it, you're not going to sell it. So first, belief in yourself. Second is belief in the product. And I would say the second skill set is to work on tenacity and consistency. So making sure that you every single day do a little bit more towards your goal. Whatever your goal is, whether it's writing a book, try to have some sort of consistent action that you're doing every day. It doesn't have to be big. Some days you might write for an hour. Some days you might write for 5 minutes. But that 5 minutes is really important because you're keeping the consistency going. And the tenacity part is important because there's a lot of things that will come.
This podcast is brought to you by AusPod Syndicate, powered by Kangaroo Fern Media Lab. Kangaroo Fern is Australia's independent video and podcast management agency with a mission to help individuals and entrepreneurs to start their own podcast.
In your way, whether it's people or whether it's situations. And the way to get over those challenges is to not give up and to always push forward and think of ways around the situation. Those, I think, are the main skills.
Okay, thank you for that. So some podcaster, even the business podcaster who have a podcast, been struggling to get downloads and also rates and review. Do we really need that to be successful in podcasting?
No. So reviews don't actually help with getting more listeners. The only thing that really helps is two things. One is good content, and two is more subscribers, people subscribing to your show. So when people subscribe to your show, you get ranked higher on iTunes. If your content is good, people will subscribe. If your content is good, people will tell other people and they will subscribe. So that's it. That is the whole secret to growing a podcast.
Do you have any final advice or anything else you want to share with our entrepreneur, startup, business owner who is watching and listening right now to our show?
Yeah, my final advice is get started. Stop thinking about it, jump in, make mistakes, and break things along the way and have fun doing it. So that's what I would say. So sign up to podbooker.com. It's free to join, and just get yourself booked on a bunch of podcasts. Don't worry too much about how you sound and how it's going to come across. Just start doing it. There's a lot of podcasts out there, and now is the time. It's the right time to be getting on shows, especially because as the market becomes saturated, it's going to get expensive. Right now it's free, so take advantage of it while you still can.
Any parting words before we wrap up the podcast?
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Mika. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So for our listener and audience as well, all the links will be on the show notes. So you can check his website, danielgefen.com, or you can also go to podbooker.com, gefenmediagroup.com as well. So all the links will be in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time. I know you've been busy during this time of the year, and thank you so much. And thank you very much also to our sponsor, the Kangaroo Fern Media Lab. It's a podcasting management service. Thank you, and see you next week for another episode of the Bootstrap Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to visit our website at www.auspodsyndicate.com.au, where you can subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, rate and review this podcast and share it with your friends. You can also join the conversation with AusPod Syndicate on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please consider on making a donation to help us keep making the podcast you love. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us.